In this video, we will create the data source. So again, this is a custom class, a custom type. So we go to our project, right click on the project name, select a new file. In the iOS template, select source, Coca Touch class. Next, we'll subclass the NS object and we'll call this data source. Probably it's a vague name, maybe we can call it contacts data source. So this is the data source for the contacts. And the language is Swift. Next, choose the group. So I'm going to put it in the same group as everything else and select create. So here is our class. The data source has an attribute which represents the list of collections. So we'll say that we'll use var because it's going to change. Provide the name. I'm going to call it contacts. You can also call it contact list or contacts as a plural. You can specify the type, or now we know that the type is inferred from the initial value. So if you're going to provide an initial value, you don't need to specify a type. And the initial value here, this type is going to be the NSMutableArray. And so we'll use the NSMutableArray and use its default initializer. So as you can see, it has many initializers. We'll just start with one that gives us an empty mutable array. So that's the only attribute that the data source will have. Then we need, in the data source, we can provide an initializer if we want, but if we don't need it, like in this case, I don't really need to do anything, because once an instance of the contact data source is created, the contact list will be initialized automatically from here. So I just need to provide the different functions that I need, and in this case, I need two functions. I need a function to provide the number of contacts in the list. So I'll create a function. So the function starts with a function name, for the keyword function, except if it is an initializer, as we saw in the creation of the contact class. So function, then we provide the name of the function. So the name needs to be expressive. So this function will give us a count. A count of what? Count of contacts. Or so we'll call it count of contacts. And then the parameter list. And if you don't have a parameter list, then you have empty parentheses like this. If the function is going to give you back a value, like in this case, we need to provide back to whoever will call this function a count. Then you need to ask yourself, what is the type of that count? The count of, I'm going to use this count to describe how many rows will be in my list. So the count of rows, and we've probably used something similar in the picker view in project number 3. So this is an integer, a non-decimal number. So I provide this arrow, which is the minus sign followed by the greater than sign. And then I need to provide the type of what this function will give you. And this, in this case, is an int. So the function will give me the int type. So this tells me that this function receives no parameters, and it has the name count of contacts, and it gives me back an integer value. Then I open the function body, and the first thing, or one thing I have to do in that function, I need to provide that count. So how do I know the count? Well, the NSMutableArray is our true manager of the list. It has all our list of contacts. So I can ask the NSMutableArray object, which I called it here contacts, if it knows the count. So I can make a variable of it, or I can use it. So I'll say contacts, here it is, dot count. So it already has, a parameter or an attribute. See here the V for the variable. So it has a variable, and that variable gives you back a type int, similar to the one that my function will do. So I don't need to do any conversions. So I'll use that. but I want this count to go back to whoever is calling this function, so I use the keyword return. So the keyword return ensures that this value goes back to whoever called that function. When you indicate that your function is returning something, you have to use the keyword return. So that's the first function I need to provide. I also need to provide a function to provide the contact at a specific index. I'll remind you with the picker view controller, where when the list is created, the operating system will come back to the data source and say, I am creating the row 0. Give me what goes in row 0. I'm creating row 1. Gives me what goes in row 1. I'm creating row 2. Give me what goes in row 2, and so on and so forth. So I need from the data source to provide the contact that has the first name, last name, and email, and I'm gonna massage it in the cell, because here I don't know where is this gonna be displayed. So I'm providing the contact object. I create a contact object and provide it for that particular index. So I'll say function, and then I'll give the name contact at index, and this one needs an index. It needs to receive something. So we'll provide, you can provide a name, or you can just provide the identifier, a label I mean, like we did with the initializer. And if we want to stay with that habit, we can provide a label, and we can say that contact index, and so that's just a label. And then the identifier, I'm going to use the identifier as index, and then the type is integer. And the function will give you back a type. So the type of the function will be the contact class. And then we define the body of the function. So what the function needs to do, it needs to find the contact object in the collection at that particular index. So again, I'm mapping the collection order to the order it will appear on the list. So we'll say here return, and then I go to my collection contacts and say give me the object at index, which will give you back an object at index and provide the index value that I need. The object at index gives you a type of that's called any object, which is a generic type. So I need to limit that generic type with the keyword as, and say I want it as the contact type, which is a conversion of type. So now and it only works if this object was originally from this type contact, which I already know because I added that type in here, or initialize that, or whoever will use it will add to it. So this is what the data source will need to provide, these two methods for now. And we can switch to the address book, and in the address book I will need to define the data source. So add the data source, or create an instance of the data source. So I'll say here var, or actually this is not gonna change, so I'll say let data source and then equal, and initialize a new data source. So I'll say this is contacts data source, and use the default initializer for the data source. And in the number of sections in the table view, I only have one section, and in the number of rows in a section, I can use the data source dot and data source and say give me the count, how many they are, the count of contacts, and that becomes the number of rows in a section. And when you run this project in this case, there is no elements in the data source. We did not add any elements in there, and there are no, the initial value of a contact is not yet added. So I can go back to the data source here, and maybe in the initializer I can add a new contact to the initializer. So this means that initialize the data source with a new contact. So I will need to override the default init method and then say super.init. I'm doing this fast because we already learned from last time. And then create a sample contact. So I'll say let sample contact equal. And if you remember when we created the contact class, we had in the default initializer, we had a sample contact. So I can use that. So I can use the default initializer of contact. And that gives me a sample initializer. Then add that to the list. So add the sample to the list. I say contacts dot add object and then add the sample contact. So this now the data source not only provides the two functions that the table view controller needs, it also adds a sample element to the array of contacts. Now the next step is to display that list in the table view controller, and we'll do that in another video.